My name is Jeffrey Becker, and I'll be talking about the mechanisms of ketamine at the neurobiological level and how this can affect clinical practice in terms of understanding the spiritual capacities and clinical leverage using ketamine in ketamine-assisted psychotherapy or in treating depression and other uses as well. I want to thank the committee for the Ketamine and Related Compounds International Hybrid Conference, and especially Rupert for his friendship and inviting me to give this talk. As far as disclosures, just to give some background, I am co-founder of Becker Biomedical. We are looking at subcutaneous ketamine delivery systems, as well as other small molecules. I'm a partner at Noetic Fund, medical advisor at Neurohacker Collective, and member of ASKP3 board. That's American Society for Ketamine Providers. I'm going to give a kind of a long talk, and it's interdisciplinary, so forgive the length, and hopefully it makes sense why it's so long. But I want to explain something that I feel was particularly interesting to me in terms of understanding how ketamine could have such profound effects with such simple mechanism, being an ion channel blocker. And I would start with explaining that there seems to be, at a spiritual level, something kind of primary that we lose as we enter adolescence that might be likened to the fall or to estrangement from kind of spiritual connection. And that if what we lose is not regained, then sometimes in adulthood, there's a vulnerability to spiritual despair, depression, these kinds of mental health issues. And that this particular process is probably, at least at some level, driven by GABAergic interneuron control over thought that gains significant control over the way we think and the kind of stereotypes in everyday waking consciousness. And that ketamine specifically blocks that GABAergic interneuron control over pyramidal cell activity, essentially inhibiting the inhibitor and releasing our thinking, our consciousness to expand beyond the normal kind of circumscribed stereotypes. One might think of this as a shift from ego-based awareness, kind of the smaller, circumscribed set of thoughts and ways of seeing the world, ways of seeing ourselves, to an experience of more of what we might call the deep self, not necessarily the subconscious so much as an expanded experience of who you are, and that this actually nicely maps onto transcendence, symbolism, and mysticism as specific, mature fields of research and study in religious studies, and that this experience might also be considered a realignment of ego-self access, which really comes out of Jungian psychology, and a powerful interaction specifically with an aspect of meaning which is symbolism, as opposed to the everyday interaction with sign that we live in normally. I'm going to refer to a poem specifically, which is Wordsworth's Odes on Intimations of Immortality, and a wonderful poem. And, I think that a lot of what he's getting at in this poem explains a little bit about what I'm getting at. You'll see these themes all over throughout the world, but this really gets at it. Our birth is but a sleep and a forgetting. Our soul hath, the soul that rises with us, our life's star, hath had elsewhere its setting and cometh from afar. But trailing clouds of glory do we come from God, who is our home. Heaven lies about us in our infancy. It's this idea that there's this kind of primary state, this connection to heaven or to God. But first, self-awareness starts to set in, and the shades of the prison house begin to close upon the growing boy. But he beholds the light, and whence it flows, he sees it in his joy. So there's this kind of growing awareness, differentiation, individuation, still connected to being, though. And then the youth, you might think of, adolescence into the early 20s, who daily farther from the east must travel, still as nature's priest, and by the vision splendid, and on his way attended. So there's this excitement in going out in the world when you're actuating the individuality that you are experiencing. There's this kind of galvanization and interest in the world. There's a lot of fun, this feeling of excitement. But then as we get older, very commonly, at length, the man perceives it die away and fade into the light of common day. And this is kind of, I think, gets at some of the kind of spiritual despair and loneliness and boredom. Sometimes it sets in the 30s and 40s in human beings. You know, what's going on here was of particular interest to me. And I ended up looking for psychological and spiritual models and ended up coming to really appreciate a lot of the Jungian modeling in psychology. But what I also found was that ketamine was so specifically effective at kind of resolving this particular issue, very effective at treating depression, but really substantially effective at treating psychological despair, kind of even spiritual despair. There's this concept that the ego emerges from self through development, and that eventually the idealized state is that the ego and the self are kind of differentiated. They're separate kind of aspects of who we are, and they live in dialogue with each other. And that the ego, while it is necessarily kind of circumscribing what we experience and how we see the world and the modeling of the world and how we model ourselves and behave in the world, that it is still connected to the self. It's receiving information from the self. It's invigorated by that wellspring of much larger being that helps us feel like we're not alone in the world, and that there's reserve. Well, if you look at what is going on in the brain, it's really quite interesting that you see starting at about 10 years old, really those tween years, you start to see substantial increases in gamma band spectral power development, increases in executive functioning, cognitive executive functional development really starts to take off. You can see at about 19, we might be kind of at a peak in terms of certain aspects of executive function, and then we kind of learn all of a sudden that we don't know everything, and then we start to kind of build maybe more of a wisdom associated with our cognitive function. I think this red line is really quite interesting. So we definitely see this in terms of brain function, EEG. There's lots of evidence about that this is occurring. It's just the psychological connection is what I'm making here. We have this process that we have to go through. If you look at the Jungian side of things, where we navigate an estrangement of the ego from the self, from the deeper aspects of ourself that occur after inflation, kind of the inflated ego, the heroic act where we go out, we try to do something, maybe we fall flat on our face, or we have some kind of embarrassment. These can be minor moments, cracking a joke in a group that doesn't get a laugh, or it can be, stuff that happens over the arc of a decade in a career development or failure that's very difficult and very painful. And in the process of kind of moving out of that alienated state into kind of what we call more of a sacrificial attitude, humility, repentance, kind of saying, oh, wow, I really don't have all these aspects of life under control. Sometimes we say, just learning how to not sweat the small stuff and let go of the big stuff as well, right? There's this acceptance, a reconnection with self, reinvigoration, and we return to wholeness. And we have to navigate this cycle over and over and over in small and large ways. And over time, this is what turns intelligence into wisdom and knowing. If we look at the stereotypes in terms of the way that we think, so if this kind of smaller ego is some kind of neurological process, what might it be? What might be going on? And most people at this point in this field probably know about the default mode network and some of the other networks. What's important to understand about the networks is that what it's getting at is that control over consciousness is not a location. It's an interrelation of areas of the brain in terms of their ability to talk with each other more commonly and not talk with other areas of the brain as commonly. And to some extent, you can think of it as it's excluding information, and it's also strengthening the connections and the kind of salience of aspects of information exchange between different areas of the brain. So it's network interrelation, different areas of the brain being more likely to talk with each other. With the default mode network, we have the medial prefrontal cortex, we have the hippocampal structures, the posterior cingulate, the temporal parietal lobe, and we also have other networks that are, of course, important beyond the default mode network. We've got central executive network, the salience network. There's a lot being figured out about this, and it's not, these are always a kind of soft definitions. Some people will include certain structures, and some people say certain aspects of the nodes that get activated in default mode network might be better thought of as a subset. But in general, we do see and do appreciate that there are these kind of network interactions, and that a lot of times they're in opposition with each other. What we will often see is that the default mode network, when it's active, the central executive network may not be. In other words, they're kind of in opposition with each other. And then when the central executive comes online, then the default mode network is less interactive and things like that. So what we do know is that there is significant network disruption in depression, really at a lot of different levels. It's not just the default mode network that gets deranged in depression. You see also changes in terms of how the salience network is interacting with kind of interior structures in the brain and posterior structures in the brain. We see very clearly, it seems, that the anterior aspect of the default mode network and the posterior aspect, if you see this very powerful connection, the connection between here and here seems to get thin and thready in depression. And there's increases in salience network structures to the anterior aspect of the default mode network, which may create a lot of that kind of frontal kind of density that you see a lot of times in depression, where people kind of are trying to think their way out of whatever kind of pain they're in, the kind of intensity, that kind of horrible feeling, and the spinning and going over and over again. We will see hyperactivation in these structures directly. One of the wonderful researchers in this field is Dr. Abdallah, and he's speaking at the conference. I can't wait to see what he's going to talk to us about. But what he was able to show was that when ketamine is given to patients with major depression, and we are to look at the prefrontal cortex, what we can see very clearly is that the areas of the prefrontal cortex in depressed patients, these are the blue patients here, that are not talking to areas of the brain that normally they would. So if you take a little area of the prefrontal cortex in this circumstance and say, okay, how specifically is this, excuse me, how specifically is this area speaking to the other areas of the brain? What you will see in depression is that very many areas are not communicating with other areas of the brain as they normally would. The red is the normal controls, healthy controls, versus patients with depression. And what you see is that there is a relatively normal distribution, but it is offset in terms of there is decreased connectivity in this circumstance. And after depression, 24 hours later, after ketamine treatment, 24 hours later, you see almost a complete normalization of this curve. It's really quite astounding. It's a wonderful example of how imaging can really show us directly things that we kind of see clinically in the patients. When you call up a patient and ask them how they're doing, how they responded to the treatment the day before, to see, to see this and also hear the clinical response. This nice correlation, not in everybody, of course, but when you do see that that rapid response, it's nice to know that you can see it in imaging as well. What we also see, even in healthy controls, not necessarily patients with depression, is that the default mode network, here again, very similar picture as compared to the one I showed you previously, becomes really quite dissembled when ketamine is given. This is light ketamine sedation, very close to the 0.5 milligram per kilogram over 40 minutes as far as a protocol. In healthy controls, again, this is not in depression. And what you see is a substantial reduction in the connectivity across the nodes of the default mode network. And you see that the areas of the brain that normally would not be speaking with those nodes. So this is a little complicated to explain, but what we're getting at here is that the areas as well that normally do not talk to the node structures in the default mode network are more likely to talk to those nodes. So the nodes are less likely to be connected to each other. They're less likely to be having those strong connections, and they're more likely to be talking to other areas of the brain that they normally don't. So this is basically imaging showing anti-correlation to the default mode network. In other words, blue areas in this picture are areas that would normally not be allowed to participate in default mode network stereotypies in terms of thinking and kind of the conscious state. And under light ketamine sedation in healthy controls, what you see is that those anti-correlated areas all of a sudden lose their anti-correlation. They're more likely to be able to talk to those nodes. So what we see probably, one way to think about this is that we see more of kind of overall kind of universal global connectivity, that the stereotypes go away and that all areas of the brain are kind of more likely to be participating in that state of mind under light ketamine sedation. One of the interesting aspects of this is that the changes, I want to be specific about this, ketamine induces these increases in hippocampal glutamate signaling. So the hippocampus is part of the default mode network. And so you would think that if it is maybe not as active in its network activity, that it has basically reduced metabolism and activity generally. And that is not what we see, actually. We see increases in glutamate signaling, while simultaneously there's a decrease in connectivity to the other aspects of the default mode network. So, forgive me for, being so specific, but it's really quite important, maybe if you are interested in this, to understand that aspect of it. So there is an increase in activity, a decrease in connectivity to the places that it normally would be talking with and connecting with, and an increase in connection to pretty much all other areas of the brain you might think about it. So it's not a reduction in activity overall, in fact. So what we know is that at some level, it's probably true that the default mode network might actually kind of separate us from aspects of spirituality that you might call awe, feelings of the sublime, whatever words you want to use for that. There's an interesting study where they took subjects and they asked them to view and rate photographs of mountains and waterfalls and forests, volcanoes, ocean waves, these kinds of things that were designed to evoke awe, essentially. And what they found is that default mode network structures were deactivated increasingly as the photos were rated higher on a sublime scale. So the more awe that the patient felt, the less likely that the default mode network was being active. So Maybe there's something about thinking about ourselves and thinking about who we are that actually separates us from the larger picture. It's kind of interesting to see all of this stuff kind of mapping nicely onto kind of spiritual concepts, and even, you know, sometimes kind of the armchair new age concepts that that float around that are, you know, common, but actually look like they have some basis in neurobiology. We also see that highly creative individuals are more likely, when you look at brain functional connectivity, more likely to be having areas of the brain talking to other areas of the brain that in kind of lower creatives you don't see. So the more network stereotypy, the more strong the network stereotypies are, it may be that separates us from certain aspects of creativity. The creative brain kind of simultaneously engages many different circuits that normally are in opposition. And this study was interesting because they pretty much explained that you could just throw somebody into a scanner, run this protocol, and you could tell, you know, who was creative and who wasn't. It was very robust in terms of the findings. So I'm going to get a little bit into what's going on with ketamine that might be causing these actions. We just saw in a lot of this imaging, what is ketamine doing to both the depressed brain and healthy controls as well. So how is this happening? I mean, how is it such a specific molecule could so rapidly bring about these changes? I just want to remind everybody about some of the ways that our brain is kind of constructed, and we have. I'm going to be talking very specifically about pyramidal cells. You know, this is a substantial portion of our gray matter is pyramidal cells. And, you know, forgive me this, for this talk, I will kind of argue that to some extent, the interaction of pyramidal cells with each other might be considered what we call thinking. A lot of the tracts that we manipulate in psychiatry kind of create flavor to thinking. They drive thinking. They bring certain areas of information from one area to another in terms of, you know, offering information to kind of shape thinking. But let's call pyramidal cell activity per se interactive exchange of information thinking per se for this. And I want to show you something that's really quite interesting, which is that the pyramidal cell receives all kinds of input. I mean, it's you know, beyond complicated, of course, and this is an incredible simplification, but there's a very specific aspect of control over pyramidal cell activity that's very important to understand if you want to understand how ketamine works, and that is that the fast spiking neurons is sometimes what they're called. They're also called parvalbumin neurons. They're part of the GABAergic interneuron net. And these are the cells that are substantially in control of pyramidal cell activity. The chandelier cell and the basket cell. The chandelier cell is sometimes called the axonic cell. And the reason it's called that is that this GABAergic neuron, this neuron that is inhibitory in terms of its activity, has its axon on the early axon segment of the pyramidal cell. And this is a very strange arrangement. Normally, the axon of a neuron sends information out into the kind of ether of neurons around it, and other neurons have their dendrites kind of sampling that information, and those neurons decide whether or not they're going to absorb that information, pass that information on, maybe tell that neuron, stop telling me that information, whatever it is. But this arrangement is strange. It was so strange that, you know, extremely groundbreaking moment when this neuron was discovered. And you know, because it's such an oddity, you can kind of think of this neuron as being like the tie around the neck of the pyramidal cell, kind of choking off activity. This is so specific that you can pretty much say that the chandelier cell is the ultimate arbiter of whether a pyramidal cell can fire or not. In other words, the chandelier cell has to release its grip, has to stop its inhibitory tone in order for a pyramidal cell to fire. Either that or the pyramidal cell has to overcome the chandelier cell inhibitory tone, which I'm going to get at in a little bit, because that's a little bit how psychedelics work as opposed to the way ketamine works. But the chandelier cell has this kind of chokehold on the pyramidal cell, and the basket cell is also inhibitory, but it has a different function. It stops the pyramidal cell after it has fired so that it doesn't continue firing. So it doesn't stay in an activated state. It's kind of almost, you can think of it as the other aspect of seizure control. If the chandelier cell were to completely let go of pyramidal cell inhibition, and all of a sudden pyramidal cells were exciting each other, and you were getting a feedback loop that goes up, very important to have the basket cell that can kind of say, hey, that's enough. I'll show you in a second. Here we are, how these work. So what we see very clearly is that in order for a pyramidal cell to fire, these are basically the frequency of firing in a pyramidal cell. You can see that the frequency, the likelihood of a pyramidal cell firing is completely in opposition to the likelihood of a chandelier cell firing. So this is the axonic cell. This is the cell that has that chokehold. It basically, when it has a chokehold on, when it's likely to be firing, you don't see pyramidal cell activity. And when it is not firing as likely, what you do see is the pyramidal cells are released and they're more likely to fire. What you see with the basket cell is that during theta, which is just kind of rest, it actually is, interestingly, fairly in line with chandelier cell. But when you get ripples, which are sometimes used as proxies for gamma activity in the brain, which is kind of high level, kind of conscious perception, an important moment, some aspect of salience and importance, and specifically, again, conscious perception. When there are these ripples, or again, a gamma moment, what we see is that the pyramidal cells are, almost by definition, are firing at increased rates. The chandelier cell is off because, of course, it has to be off. But the basket cell is right behind the pyramidal cell, kind of saying, okay, you're firing, now stop. Okay, you can fire, but stop. You can fire, but stop. And it kind of puts a cap on it, puts a lid. So you have two different levels of control to kind of control scope of consciousness about whether or not pyramidal cells are firing or not, or exchanging information. What we know also, this is you remember that slide I showed you earlier regarding this increase in kind of gamma executive wave power. What we also see is that there is an increase in these parvalbumin PV cells, fast spiking cells, these fast spiking GABAergic interneurons, the chandelier cell, the basket cell. PV is a marker that's used in staining and in order to kind of look at the tissues. So we see this substantial increase in the percentage of maximum that starts, when the child is kind of learning a little bit about, being in the world. And there's increases all into later adult development. Interesting. We also see these GABA-A receptor changes that are going up, and the GABA cassettes, those let me take a step back and show you. These are sometimes called cassettes because they have this kind of nodal activity. They almost look like fingers around the neck of the neuron. It's really quite interesting. We see increases in those as well that you really set in. As you remember how there's this, again, drop, and then there's this rise again that kind of tracks to that other slide that I showed you. This is an example of some of those cassettes. This is here a chandelier cell. This is one chandelier cell that is spreading its its control over pyramidal cells, which are the red cells here. And all of these little green dots are those cassettes. You can think of those as kind of fingers, hands around the axon segment of a pyramidal cell. And what's fascinating about the chandelier cell is that one chandelier cell can control upwards of 300 pyramidal cells that are surrounding it. And that's really a lot of control. And what we also see is that the chandelier cells, it turns out, are able to share information with each other without synaptic interaction. They do synapse on each other. They do exchange information through neurotransmitter exchange, but they also actually exchange information and exchange depolarization through gap junctions. What they have been able to show is that electrical coupling was only found in these GABAergic interneurons, that pyramidal cells were not coupled in this way. So in other words, there are these kind of weld points where depolarization can spread from one neuron to another. And if you think of that chandelier cell as controlling maybe 300 or having some input, not 100% control, but input upon control over pyramidal cells around it. And it's sharing information with another chandelier cell, which is maybe doing the same thing in proximity. You have a very powerful aspect to constrict and control and stereotype consciousness. This is an example of a synaptic interaction between these fast spiking neurons, parvobutynin cells. Whether it's a basket cell or a chandelier cell is unclear in this, but this weld point right here, here's a close-up. This is a gap junction where depolarization can spread from one cell to another. And these are, this is another example of these kind of weld points. And this is actually pretty cool if you know how to do those stereoscopic images where you cross your eyes. This will pop out in 3D if you enjoy that kind of thing. This is just fascinating. I mean, the fact that it's almost like a plastic matrix going across, the fact that the information does not have to exchange with synaptic activity, I think is fascinating in terms of how different it is. The inhibitor of consciousness and the stereotyping kind of master control, maybe over consciousness, is not organized in the same way as the thinking itself. And this is quite specific and interesting and important for us to understand this aspect of it that I'm about to show you, because this is finally getting to how ketamine works. The NMDA receptors on these chandelier cells that ketamine attaches to are not necessarily that different from the other cells, the other NMDA receptors that are on the pyramidal cells. But they seem to be different enough, or there seems to be something going on that causes chandelier cells to kind of live at a more depolarized state. They're more likely to be firing than the pyramidal cells that they're controlling, or pyramidal cells that are around it in general, not necessarily that they're directly in control. But if you compare pyramidal cells versus the chandelier cells are kind of more excited, more likely to be firing than the pyramidal cells that you're looking at. And it kind of makes sense if you think about it. If you think about, the supervisor who is watching the worker or watching what it is supervising, it may need to be in a more excited state. It has to be kind of more vigilant because it's doing the watching. What we see very clearly is that when an NMDA receptor antagonist is given, and this is not in vivo, of course, but this is playing out. We're pretty sure that this is what's going on. That when an NMDA receptor antagonist, this is a very powerful antagonist that's used commonly in research, MK801, one of the first NMDA receptor antagonists found and used in research. When these antagonists are given, what you see is that the normally high level of tone that you see in these GABAergic interneurons, in contrast to the lower tone in the pyramidal cells, you see it drop. Essentially, you see those GABAergic interneurons having trouble firing. They're not firing as much. And what you see is release of pyramidal cells and increase in firing. So you might think of this as giving ketamine instead of 801 to a patient in your office. And what you see is that these GABAergic interneurons all of a sudden are not firing. The inhibitor has become inhibited. And you see a release of pyramidal cell inhibition and a kind of blooming of activity and information exchange across the pyramidal cells. Here's another drawing of that, to show you this specifically. And what we believe is that this higher firing rate that we see in the chandelier cell, this more likely to fire this kind of depolarized state, probably at some level kicks the magnesium out of the pore and allows the ketamine to get into the NMDA receptors on those neurons preferably. So if we give just the right amount of ketamine, not so much we get anesthesia and we're turning off neurons all over the place, just the right amount, it goes to the open pores that are out there, which happen to be on these cells that inhibit consciousness. So the controlling force, the chandelier cells that are controlling consciousness, more likely to be depolarized, which means they're more likely to not have the ketamine in the pore of the NMDA receptor. And that's a necessary state for the ketamine to get into the pore and block the receptor. So it's really kind of an exquisite set of circumstances that allows us to gain this release with NMDA receptor antagonism. This is just to remind everybody about how this works. So the magnesium sits normally. Magnesium is the natural endogenous divalent ion that sits inside the NMDA receptor pore, very close to the PCP site where ketamine attaches. And if the magnesium is in there, then ketamine can't get in there. As the membrane of the neuron starts to become slightly depolarized, what happens is there's a change in the shape of the receptor and the magnesium gets kicked out, and that can allow ketamine to get in and block that receptor for a period of time. And what we know is that there are also aspects of localization of different types of NMDA receptors. And this may actually play out. There's this kind of an evolving bit of research, is quite an interesting thread, that magnesium is actually less likely, has a lower affinity for certain forms of receptors, specifically probably the NR2C subunit. And what that causes is that if you were to take magnesium out completely in let's say an in vitro study, you grow neurons and then you check NMDA receptor antagonism and firing rates and that, but the medium has no magnesium, which again is the natural endogenous antagonist of the NMDA receptor. So you've removed the natural molecule that would sit there and block an NMDA receptor antagonist from getting into that receptor. If you do that, basically you see, mostly the receptors are not that different in terms of their activity. They're the inhibition that ketamine produces. But what you do see is that in natural circumstances with 1 millimolar magnesium, which is kind of physiologic, what you see is this differentiation, and that the 2C receptor, the NR2 subunit with the C subtype, is less likely to be as affected by the lack of magnesium, probably because those receptors have a lower affinity for magnesium to begin with. And there seems to be a growing awareness that localization of different glutamate receptor and 2C subunits in parvalbumin positive, again, fast spiking interneurons, chandelier cells, basket cells, that this subunit is maybe specifically located to certain aspects of and locations that control our thinking. So we're also seeing that the 2D receptor, which also there's some similarities to what I was saying, 2C and 2D. You can kind of parlay what I was just describing from 2C over to 2D to some extent, that the 2D mRNA was selectively in parvalbumin positive cells of the human in postmortem dorsolateral prefrontal cortex tissue, not in pyramidal cells. So the summary on that is that it very well may be that we're starting to understand why those chandelier cells and possibly in basket cells that are kind of inhibiting pyramidal cells are more likely to be able to accept the ketamine that we give in sub-anesthetic dosing. I want to show you a few things about brain waves because this is also, I think, kind of important to understand about what's happening in the room when you give a patient ketamine. Just to remind everybody, we've got delta wave, which is very, very slow. We see this in deep sleep, and we see it in certain aspects. Sometimes any given area, you might see some delta wave function, but we see a huge increase in that spectral band power when we go into deep sleep. It's kind of very slow, kind of brain is off almost. Theta wave is kind of, we might say daydreaming, and that's kind of 4 to 7 hertz, like wah, 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 kind of level. And alpha waves, kind of alert, ready for action, but not necessarily taking action. Beta, more kind of where we live every day when we're getting stuff done, doing stuff, kind of flurry of activity. And then gamma waves, as I described before, which are the highest frequencies and sometimes are localized to certain areas. We kind of see them kind of popping up in different areas, not necessarily global gamma in terms of all kinds of areas talking to each other, but moments of conscious perception, to some extent, some of those kind of what those ripples might signify that I was showing you before. But I think this is fascinating that I just took this literally straight from Wikipedia, that gamma wave is a pattern of neural oscillation that may be implicated in creating unity of conscious perception. Not that Wikipedia is always right, but they kind of got it right in a certain way. There's a lot of debate about this. I don't want to speak that this is 100% gospel, but there seems to be something to this, that when there are these gamma kind of flurries, that something's happening, some perception, some salience, some importance is being recognized. And that when all these neuronal clusters oscillate together, they help bring a distributed matrix of consciousness together, kind of bringing information together and saying, okay, this is the wholeness here, to generate kind of a coherent, concerted cognitive act, such as perception. What we see with ketamine is that delta, theta, alpha, and beta wave frequency, essentially, these are all significant, and not as much, we don't see as much reduction in beta, but these were actually significant findings in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate, that are aspects of the default mode network. We see those other frequencies, that the band power go down, and we see the gamma band power go up. So we see this very substantial increase in gamma band power and reduction in the power in the other bands. We see this in the salience network. We see this in the central executive network. And this has been replicated, actually just kind of looking at regions, not necessarily looking at network interactions or network locations. This is just looking at interior, central, parietal, and occipital lobes. And we see here again, kind of increases in gamma power and decreases in the power in the other bands in general. What might this mean? I mean, so what? You might say, okay, so there's increases in gamma. One thing I would say is that remember that there's increases in gamma, and there's also increases in any given area of the brain to be talking with any other area of the brain, and decreases in the stereotypes of which areas of the brain are talking to which areas of the brain. So you have this kind of almost gamma singularity happening over the whole brain. You might think of it like that. Here's another imaging picture showing kind of the coolness in those lower four bands and an increase in activity, a warmness. So the red colors signify increased power. You can see the shift here, and you can see all these other areas getting cooler. What we see is that practitioners of long-term meditation, those people that have done their 10,000 to 50,000 hours of meditation, can rapidly go into a state of mind that may actually look somewhat like what happens with ketamine, where there are very large increases in gamma wave power band. And this didn't necessarily show that these areas are, less correlated in terms of network interactions or any of that, but it's really quite fascinating. What they did show was that even controls, even people who didn't have a lot of meditation, after 1 week of practice, were able to increase their gamma activity. So, 10,000 hours is a lot, but even a little bit of meditation might actually help us get into this state without the need for ketamine. So it's always important to have an interdisciplinary approach to depression when you're talking with patients, because hopefully you can help them know what other tools are available out there. So, in summary, I just want to explain, because I'm going to explain what psychedelics do. So I just want to do a quick kind of overview again. We have these chandelier cells that control pyramidal cell activity on the early axon segment through GABAergic synapses. They release GABA onto this axon, and through chloride influx can stop a signal from coming down. Even if this pyramidal cell may want to fire, it cannot sometimes get through this inhibitory tone. What's interesting, though, is the pyramidal cell itself can actually stimulate the chandelier cell. And this is a nice way to gain control, that if the pyramidal cell does fire, okay, it can tell the chandelier cell, I just fired, you may want to turn me off now. So that makes sense if you think about just feedback loops and making sure that things don't get out of control. What we see is that ketamine probably preferentially gets onto the NMDA receptors that are on these chandelier cells. And so when the pyramidal cell is telling the chandelier cell that it has fired, the chandelier cell is less likely to hear that signal and turn that signal off. And in addition, exchange of information across is not necessarily able to move to kind of coordinate control over pyramidal cell activity. And so what you see is this increase in neurotransmission coming out of pyramidal cells. And what I would say in terms of what I'm about to get into, which is the kind of what happens in the room and the psychological and spiritual aspect of it, is that you might think of this as a decrease in ego tone, a decrease in the kind of tonic inhibition of consciousness that reduces consciousness, stereotypes consciousness. You might consider that to be ego. And this is a reduction, a decreased ego tone state. Well, what is the state then if it's not as much ego? I'm going to get into that. If you look at psychological models, you might say that it is more the encounter with self. And I want to point to this because the experience that patients have in the room when you're working with ketamine can be quite profound. And I think it can be, it's interesting, it's powerful, but it has a gentleness to it. And I'm going to get into why that gentleness might be there. This is a very oft quoted piece from William James that's in the Varieties of Religious Experience in his section on mysticism. He says, some years ago, I myself made some observations on this aspect of nitrous oxide intoxication. It is that our normal waking consciousness, rational consciousness as we call it, is but one special type of consciousness, whilst all about it, parted from it by the filmiest of screens, there lie potential forms of consciousness entirely different. This is after inhaling nitrous oxide. He came to understand this as that one lungful of gas that basically went to his brain, blocked NMDA receptors, we believe preferentially on chandelier cells, and allowed him to kind of see this larger level of consciousness. Well, it turns out in 1998, we found out that nitrous oxide is an NMDA receptor antagonist. And very interesting that he was able to kind of see that way back then. Now we tend to get more information, more subjective information from ketamine in terms of ketamine reports and things like that. But nitrous oxide has a lot of profound accounts, especially from this group back at the turn of 2 centuries ago. This is actually very interesting. This was Zenos Clark writing to William James about his experience with nitrous oxide. And he says, at the moment of recovery, just then, before starting on life, I catch a glimpse of the eternal process in the act of starting. There's a very sweet way of describing things. We travel on a journey that was accomplished before we set out. And the real end of philosophy is when we remain in our destination, being already there. Really kind of interesting kind of spiritual concept. When we cease our intellectual questioning. So that kind of parsing, either or kind of thinking. This is why there's a smile upon the face of the revelation as we view it. And I wanted you to hear this particular aspect of what he said. It tells us that we are forever a half a second too late. And I think what is very interesting is that if you look at the NMDA receptor and how long its activity basically can be measured, it is about 0.4 seconds actually at its far end. And if Zenos Clark called it as half a second and instead of 0.4 seconds, I think it may be that he is the first person to ever describe NMDA receptor pharmacodynamics before we even had any understanding of neurotransmission and receptors, essentially. So the NMDA receptors that are on these pyramidal cells, that are on these chandelier cells, if we are blocking their activity, and their activity normally lasts for about 0.4 seconds in terms of maybe control. Lots of extrapolation here, but it's a lot of fun to think that he may have been able to describe what's going on at some level experientially that matches pharmacodynamics really quite nicely. I'm going to talk a little bit about psychedelics specifically, actually. Yeah, so maybe that's important to see there. The psychedelics work differently. We have an increase in pyramidal cell kind of exchange of information, we believe, with psychedelics, but it looks like it happens in a very different way. That the 5-HT2A receptor that psychedelics kind of generally attach to, it's a G-coupled receptor, and it increases the likelihood of a given neuron to be able to fire based on the signals that it's receiving. So what you have is kind of a global, almost a global stimulant for pyramidal cells that's very direct, that's not coming from a tract like a dopamine tract or a norepinephrine tract or something like that, kind of driving those neurons. Instead, this is actually just turning up the activity of the neurons or the potential of a neuron to be active generally without any specific flavor necessarily. And what we may think of this, instead of it being like I described where the inhibitor is inhibited, instead what we may see with the psychedelics is that the pyramidal cell is more likely to fire and push through the inhibition that's there. So the inhibitor is not inhibited, instead the inhibitor is overwhelmed. And I think that gives us a lot of insight into why the psychedelics can be so harrowing for some individuals. The psychedelics are known to be heterogeneous in terms of people's response. They're not necessarily as friendly. They are often more powerful. I think that they can actually bring people an experience that they can remember later much more easily. And that may very well be that the inhibiting forces in the brain become kind of overwhelmed and possibly have to kind of learn a new humility, if I can use a kind of psychological term or even a spiritual term, learning that they're not necessarily in full control over, what is and don't have necessary primacy. But in general, I think it's very important to understand that with the psychedelics, ego tone is still intact to some extent, and that the ego basically becomes overwhelmed and sometimes kind of forced into a state of submission. Let's see, so I can contrast those two. This is an interesting quote from Huxley, who really gets at the intensity of the psychedelics. He says, visionary experience, it's not always blissful. It's sometimes terrible. There's hell as well as heaven. Like heaven, the visionary hell has its preternatural light and its preternatural significance, but the significance is intrinsically appalling. And the light is the smoky light of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the darkness visible of Milton. Quite intense and quite real. I think this is one of the better quotes to help someone understand some of the darkness that they might experience. It does not mean that darkness that the psychedelics can sometimes force upon an individual doesn't have its purpose. I think that it can be a very powerful route to healing, but it needs to be kind of understood in this new area where we're going to be hopefully applying more consciousness medicine in patient care. So in summary, with the psychedelics, we have what might be considered increase in kind of self-tone, increase in just kind of global activity. The larger seaplane of what can happen is kind of forced upon the ego. It's kind of like pushing more information through the same size hole, increasing pressure. You can imagine in that kind of circumstance that you might go from kind of laminar flow to chaotic flow to turbulence. And ketamine is in many ways almost exactly the opposite in terms of mechanisms, that it may represent decrease in ego tone instead, and that you are pushing more information, but it is by increasing the aperture. It may be that its warmth and its gentleness comes from that, you don't necessarily get the turbulence. In fact, you might even get increased laminar flow if you just think about the pipes in your home. Makes sense. So if you look at kind of a logic summary of ketamine's effects, there's this kind of trio of activity that kind of can help a little bit understand maybe what's going on. There's this release of pyramidal cells from inhibition through NMDA receptor blockade that primarily affects GABAergic interneurons. And that can be seen possibly as an expansion from what one is not, in other words, what's left over after inhibition, to what one is. So again, kind of using the language of logic a little bit. There's also increased AMPergic activity in pyramidal cells due to excessive synaptic glutamate and possible direct effects from ketamine metabolites. We're not quite sure. This might be seen as enhancement even of what one is. So it's not just that what one is allowed to be seen or allowed to be felt, but that there's actually kind of even an expansion of it. We definitely see increases in activity at a minimum, just to make the point. And then there's decreased NMDA receptor activity in pyramidal cells, not as much, of course, as what we're seeing in the chandelier cells and the inhibitory cells, but it's very unlikely that there is not some ketamine getting onto NMDA receptors on pyramidal cells, which may decrease the prolonged time window of increased excitability. And you might see that as a decreased awareness of what one was. So in any given moment, we kind of are what we are experiencing, the isness of what we're experiencing when NMDA receptors are active is informed by what we just were. And if pyramidal cells have decreases in NMDA receptor activity a little bit, relationally, relatively less, of course, like I said, but some, there may be a decreased awareness of what one was. And so there's a kind of nowness to ketamine that this might help to explain a bit. I'm going to move to how to use this or how to consider this when you're working with patients. because there's a very specific kind of spiritual and psychological power to ketamine. And I think of it in a number of different arenas. And there's more than just this, but I'm, try to give at least organized way of thinking about it, or how I think of it. I think that ketamine, very specifically with patients, allows them to kind of remember who they are being, the largeness, their wholeness. You'll see this a lot with patients where they kind of rediscover aspects of themselves, remember that they're a loving human, and sometimes that, that ego insult, or that narcissistic injury, or whatever it is, that they might be feeling shame and guilt, and they kind of can see themselves again, and remember, see themselves with kind of loving kindness and that kind of thing. And also rediscover aspects of themselves that they've kind of forgotten, reclaiming and rediscovery. So there's also very clearly, I believe, symbolic discovery, symbolic interaction. And I'm going to get into that in a second, what symbol is and why it's important in working with patients with ketamine. But there's healing to be gained from the psychic experience of ketamine, where symbol is probably definitely key. Resolution of paradox is a very important aspect of the experience for a lot of patients, and in general is a very important aspect for kind of spiritual evolution, growth. It's considered, I think, to be more of a wisdom state than an intellectual state. But you will see very commonly patients experiencing the world not in either or, right or wrong, good or bad, black or white. These kinds of dichotomies kind of fall away, and there's this resolution of paradox. And then finally, encounter with the self. Experiencing the self is sometimes even often experienced as an encounter with God in some individuals. And this is not just my observation. This is something that goes back, and you can read in Jungian psychology as well. The remembering who we are, I think that depression, this is a quote from a chapter I wrote in the ketamine papers, that it can be interpreted through many lenses, but the universal ever-present theme is one of alienation. Patients feel small, cut off from previously available sources of strength, both within themselves and within the social milieu they belong to. And what you see very commonly with ketamine is people returning to a sense of belonging, and a rediscovery and reinvigoration of a lot of those internal resources, and a kind of resolution of this kind of alienated feeling. So the other aspect of it, so I'm going through my layers. So symbolic discovery, I'm going to take a second and just talk about this. Symbol versus sign is kind of an important Jungian concept. It's important all over the place, but the idea here is that in our everyday consciousness, in our everyday kind of circumscribed state of mind, we interact much more specifically with sign than with symbol. Sign comes to replace symbol, point to symbol, but is not symbol itself. So an example of sign is basically words. If I say the word tree, you may think of a tree. Everyone in the audience may think of a tree. They may think of different trees, but are they able to actually fully grasp tree-ness? There are these moments, I mean, there's a reason I'm using tree is because we have poems about trees, about finally seeing trees, really understanding what a tree is. That moment when you see a tree and you realize, oh, that's not what I thought it was. That's not what I thought tree was, right? So we interact with sign mostly in our lives, in everyday consciousness, and it separates us from the actuality of what something is. We need to do this. This is very important. We need to model the world around us, and we need to be able to act in the world, and we need to have shorthand versions, because of the intensity of reality is pretty overwhelming. So this is a very necessary function, but it can be sometimes mistaken for something that it's not. Sometimes we believe that the sign that we're interacting with is the actual thing, and that's a very common mistake of the ego. Symbol is the actual kind of archetypal image or representation that points to the essential thing that is unknown, but can be kind of grasped in moments. It's kind of the mystery, and mystery in any given area. It conveys the kind of living subjective meaning, and when we interact with symbol, it releases and transforms our psychic energy, carries that psychic energy to the ego, either consciously or unconsciously, and brings life energy, which supports and guides us through our lives. And very specifically, an important aspect is that symbol is found, not manufactured. And I'll give you just a quick example of that, is that we have a lot of sci-fi where we have interaction with aliens. And I think it's probably reasonable to say that if we were to experience intelligent life on another planet, that they would be interacting with archetypes in similar ways as us, that we didn't invent love, that love is something that is real, that we are interacting with, and other species interact with it, that we didn't invent psychic distress and pain with loss, alienation. I mean, we can see this in other species on this earth alone. So there's something kind of important about that, to think about that we are probably interacting with things and the kind of aspects of being, a layer of being that may be very real, is very difficult to define, but is not something that we've invented through our consciousness in that reductionist kind of model. In an ideal world, our ego is separate from but receptive to symbol. The bottom paragraph here. This is kind of the desired state of health, where we're receiving information from the self, but we're not being subsumed by the self, which is kind of a state where the ego identifies or merges with symbol. This can be a very immature state. It can actually be even kind of the quality, the underlying quality that kind of is as psychosis or kind of extreme personality disorders. Ego, when it's alienated from symbol, on the other hand, can be kind of a state of nihilism, where symbol is kind of robbed of its life force. And those individuals that you work with, where the mystery is kind of extinguished, there's no wonder in their life, that awe has disappeared. And so the ultimate goal in kind of Jungian psychotherapy, at some level, I mean, there's a lot of goals, of course, but is to make the symbolic process more conscious, to bring symbol into life, to see the symbolic image behind symptoms, can ultimately transform that experience. And what's important to know is that it doesn't necessarily take away pain, but it makes pain meaningful. And I think that's an important distinction, and it's important when you're working with people to help them understand that, is that, connection to this, it doesn't necessarily take away the pain, but meaning is a very, very bolstering and important aspect of life. And, at some level, I studied religion in undergrad. I focused in mysticism, and what I found over and over again is that these patternings, these kind of levels of being, again, if we're talking about symbol and the self and the archetypes, can be kind of localized in the level of soul, versus mind, where maybe that realm of ideas, where the ego lives, versus the body. I mean, you just see this mapped out in all kinds of different disciplines. In Christianity, you've got, Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. What's going on there? Like, why is there such a specific focus on that? I believe what they're trying to get at is naming different levels of being. In Western culture, we have religion, psychology, psychiatry, and then psychiatry kind of bridging down to the body. We have medicine that's more located in the body. Phenomenological qualities, we have kind of the difference between wisdom, intuition, and knowing, and intelligence, ethics, and knowledge, versus prowess, instinct, and skill. And at the logical level, I kind of touched on this before, you've got at the body, and even in receptor language, we've got antagonists and agonists. And in the mind, we tend to think a lot in terms of either or thinking, kind of accepting that there's the paradox. And we think a lot in terms of what is not. Again, what's left over after inhibition, whereas at the soul level, we think more about what is, and the paradox falls away, and a lot of times things are both and, black and white become gray. The yin and the yang come together. And again, alchemical poem, as heaven above, heaven below, stars above, stars below, all that is above also is below. This is an interesting next statement. Grasp this and rejoice. That understanding this seems to be important for feeling connected, belonging, for being at peace. And this fits very specifically in terms of the mystic archetype, in terms of layers of being, and how we interact across those layers of being. This aspect, this resolution of paradox, moving out of symbol and more into this aspect of paradox, is a very specific aspect of mature spiritualism, kind of understanding that the paradox is kind of a false construct. Edward Edinger, I really appreciate as a translator of Jung, and also developed really a lot of his own very powerful ideas. Says specifically, I understand consciousness to be a substance, a psychic material, otherwise not always invisible and intangible to the senses, the process whereby a series of psychic contents, complexes and archetypal images make connection with the ego, with an ego, has as its most characteristic feature the encounter of opposites. Okay. This again is, I think, a very important aspect to kind of understand when you're working with ketamine, that if this kind of gamma singularity is occurring, that areas that are normally anti-correlated with each other are all of a sudden able to be correlated with each other. It wouldn't be surprising to posit that some psychological aspect of what we're seeing in that imaging is actually leading to this characteristic feature of the encounter of opposites and the kind of resolution of paradox. And to move forward with the encounter with self, the kind of fourth, and I think a very important aspect of ketamine experience for patients. Remember, I was talking about that ego separating from the self, but that there's this connectivity, this conduit between the two. The larger aspect of our wholeness, our whole being, versus the smaller circumscribed kind of everyday hunt for nuts and berries, knowing how to do things that we don't want to do in order to reach a goal in the future. All those kinds of aspects of ego function, very important, but not necessarily the whole aspect of who we are, but they're connected. And again, in depression, one might think of that connection as becoming very thready, and that the ego might become more and more circumscribed, more lonely, more alienated from this deeper aspect of self. Well, this is an actual case report that I would present here. So this was a 38-year-old female, existential crisis, and she had this particular symbolism that came out in her experience. She had a very kind of duty-bound state of mind, a strong ego, but a lot of shame and guilt, kind of an alienation from intuitive function, sometimes because of that, feeling often that she wasn't good enough, she wasn't meeting her own ideals, and that was a painful state, and a state that separated her a lot of times from joy and feeling belonging. If you look at this, this is similar to that drawing, and you might think of this connection between ego and self being somewhat thready. There's some blocks. Symbolism is unavailable to the ego. She had this experience very specifically of explaining that she was in a pod, and that pod was connected by an oxygen line to a submarine that was near her. The submarine was over there. She was in the pod, and she was connected specifically with this oxygen line. And then she said, wait, this is interesting. It's not a submarine, it's a fish. And what she found was she was no longer in the pod. She was swimming and she was next to the fish. And when she touched the fish, she was infused with a deep sense of belonging, of goodness, of kind of self-knowledge, understanding that she is good, that she's got a good soul at some level. And what I think is really sweet is that she was able to look at the eye of the fish and also see this kind of sly smile, this kind of smile that said kind of everything she needed to know. Isn't it so silly that you thought that you were bad, and that kind of thing. So that symbol, the fish, became a very, very important aspect for her that she brought back from her experience. And I would call that kind of capturing the symbol. So the symbolism, again, being very important, but that symbol very specifically is encounter with the self, and that she is separate from, but receiving information from, and is deeply taken care of and infused with meaning and infused with belonging in the interaction with that self. And I just think this is kind of a powerful example that if you are a clinician and you're working with patients, if you look for this, you will find it. You will find it all over the place. It's really quite interesting how specific the symbolism plays out in the patients that you will work with. And it's a lot of fun. I will tell you that when you capture something like this, it can become a very powerful, almost an amulet for the patient that they can turn to. She will mention the fish almost passingly at this point, but at first we kind of were talking about it, but it's kind of a symbol that she turns to understand the experience and also kind of remind herself. And I'm going to show you something very similar. This is a different patient, a lot of childhood abuse, 56-year-old female with daily suicidal ideation. And she had this kind of classic mothership and the pod out in space kind of symbolism. Somewhat similar kind of patterning. Again, lots of cluster B strategy, defending from despair. And I would watch her often receive important information from her life and really receive gifts, and then watch her ego and her intellectual defenses sometimes, or sometimes just the intense fear, anxiety, pick apart the experience and kind of destroy it, not receive it. She had this experience of being in a pod in space and having this feeling that something important was going to happen. And then she realized she was moving towards a mothership, and that as she was approaching the mothership, the intensity grew in her kind of awareness, something important is going to happen. And as the docking happened, she was again infused with this sense of meaning, this kind of sense of belonging, this sense that she is okay, and that a lot of the trauma was in her past, that she is essentially whole when her wholeness is experienced, that the smaller alienated, scared aspects of herself are only part of herself. And I put at the bottom, how to think about maybe the symbol for her. This is a sci-fi fan. She loves sci-fi movies, and we pretty much, moved into those metaphors, those symbols. I think when you look at symbolism, we have wonderful, wonderful ways to look at this in any given mode that a person is interested in. You can turn to religious traditions, you can turn to sci-fi movies, you can turn to Harry Potter, you can go Lord of the Rings. It doesn't really matter. It's really where the patient's interest is, and they will help you help them to capture the symbol, what works for them. So yeah, I'm nearing the end here, but I think again that this specific aspect of ketamine is very important in terms of the connection between the ego and the self. If this whole gamma power increase and interaction across the whole brain is occurring, that this may very well be specifically what's happening, and that this ego self-access restitution can occur, and we can move through that psychic life cycle and get out of a stuck state. That expansion of personal consciousness requires successful navigation of that tension, and that is often very difficult and painful, kind of dark night of the soul in a hero's journey. Edinger says this quite well. He says a connection between the ego and the self is vitally important to psychic health. It gives foundation, structure, and security to the ego, and also provides energy, interest, meaning, and purpose. And when the connection is broken, the result is emptiness, despair, meaninglessness, and in extreme cases, psychosis or suicide. I think if you work in psychiatry and psychology and you work in mental health, this is not an extreme statement. So again, I believe that ketamine very, very nicely can resolve depression when people are kind of stuck in this state of melancholic depression, alienation from the self, a state of kind of chronic woundedness, and move people through by having the kind of encounter with self, moving through and reconnecting to original wholeness. And that this maps really quite nicely onto the neurobiological mechanisms of ketamine and what we're finding out over these years. So again, I want to thank the conference and thank the organizers for inviting me. And I'd be happy to answer questions. And thank you very much. I'll run through the bibliography here just so that you have it. And you can always pause it and look at it. Thank you very much.